This Stephen J. Lee essay is called Assess the Impact of Nazi Indoctrination on Germany's Youth. Okay, so what I'll do is the normal process. If you can download these notes, which I've taken from the essay, they're in the folder in the Centre Zone. Print them off, and I'll take you through the key points. Fairly straightforward essay. This there's some useful additional information that you that lifts that will lift your knowledge and understanding above that of the textbook. Especially statistical information. Okay, so let's move in. The introduction first of all. Useful little quote there from a speech that Hitler gave in 1933, where he said, "When an opponent declares, 'I will not come over to your side,' I calmly say, 'Your child belongs to us already.'" Learn from the way Lee writes here, the way you can include speeches or short quotes yourself. I do constantly emphasise that short quotes from primary sources are very, very useful in strengthening arguments. This particular quote, you can be using in the two ways here. First of all, it highlights how important the youth was for the Nazi regime. And then secondly, although indoctrination was a long-term process, it could be applied most effectively to Germany's youth. They were the group that could be targeted quickly and with most immediate impact. For the reason that adults, and that comes across there, and to some extent in 1933, the generation of adults, if adults were opponents to Hitler, they were harder to deal with. You could terrorise them into submission, but in terms of winning them over and convincing them about Nazis' ideas, turning them from being just passive opponents to being active supporters, it's much more difficult for adults. Whereas for children, more easily influenced, and of course they have not been influenced as much by ideas from the Weimar Republic era. Okay, so let's get into the structure. But basically, what Lee does in this essay, and you can see this from the notes and the headings, is he looks at indoctrination in education first, which he breaks down into schools and universities. And within each of those, he looks at what were the policies and how far did he succeed. And then in the second half of the essay, he moves into indoctrination of leisure, okay, the time outside formal education. So first of all, indoctrination in schools. What were the Nazi policies? Make sure you learn that date, the law of the 20th of March 1933. Interesting date that, it was the day before the law of Potsdam, so before the day of Potsdam. It provided for the separate education of boys and girls. Okay. It ended confessional schools, in other words, church schools, separate church schools, and it placed curbs on private education. I mean, clearly, the state is making its claim not just on the physical bodies of young people, but on their minds. So clearly, therefore, there's no future for private schooling inside Nazi Germany. Okay, so next point. The school curricula was radicalised so that it became a vehicle for imparting Nazi ideology, in particular racial ideology. So new subjects were introduced: race studies, eugenics, and health biology. And conventional subjects, history, mathematics, etc., were geared at every opportunity to enhancing Nazism. So, for example, in history, the teaching of history was very much slanted to make children proud of Germany, to the extent that dates and events, etc., were falsified Mathematics was used. Well, an example is there. 22 out of 76 pages of the official maths textbook contained ideological references, e.g., work out the cost of producing lunatic asylums as opposed to the cost of making workers' housing, with obviously an implicit message that that funding should go towards workers' housing, not supporting mentally ill people who were viewed as a burden on the regime. The Minister for Education, who was a member of the Nazi Party, that's Coordination from Above, Bernhard Rust, very famously said, and again it's a nice little quote for you, the purpose of textbooks was the ideological education of young German people. Next point. Boys and girls were prepared for separate and stereotyped roles, which impacted on their curriculum choices. Okay, so girls' role in terms of Hitler's worldview obviously was to become child bearers, not just quantity of children but quality of children. Pure Aryan, so it's about selecting an appropriate mate. Big emphasis on home economics, whereas boys were being prepared for public service. Their role was very much service, either in leadership or ultimately military service. So their curriculum choices very different, sciences and classes. And obviously it's not actually listed there. PE was adapted. PE for all, but the type of PE activities varied depending whether you were a boy or a girl. Okay, boys are obviously learning those team skills as preparation for the military. Girls are learning sort of exercises that will widen their childbearing hips, etc., etc. Okay, next point. Elite schools. There were special schools to mould the future leadership of the Volksgemeinschaft. Remember that key word, the people's community. This is what Hitler is aspiring to achieve, a unity of all German people defined by race. The Napolers were the schools that prepared special schools for future government officials and in particular army leaders. And then you've got these Adolf Hitler schools and Ordensburg and the castles of the order, which respectively were preparing children to be future party leaders, that's the Adolf Hitler schools, and SS leaders, that's the castles of order. Common feature of all these changes was the emphasis on race and anti-Semitism. Jews were forced out of German schools and allowed only to attend Jewish schools. That happened very early on. The separation that was in 1933, but eventually even separate Jewish schools, they were finally abolished in 1942 because of course by 1942 the Holocaust genocide had been decided upon as the final solution. Number 5, the teaching profession was carefully reorganised. Now the Nazi Teachers League, the NSLB, the National Socialist Lehrerbund, had been established in 1929 to win teachers' votes, on the whole very successfully. More on that in a few minutes. By 1935, 25% of teachers belonged to the NSLB. That was a remarkable increase to 97% by 1937. So the vast majority of teachers were forced to join, and if they didn't, then they would be dismissed. And it's not just belonging to it, but there would be inspections, and you would be expected to be supporting Nazi ideology in your teaching. Otherwise, it would be pretty much instant dismissal. Okay, an assessment then. Problems, failures, etc. There was extensive conflict between the various agencies involved. Okay, so very useful for section B here. More examples of inefficiency. The Ministry of Education under Rust continued to use the guidelines of the Weimar Republic, argued interminably with Nazi Party headquarters about the shape to be taken by their replacement. Other examples, Bernhard Rust, the Minister for Education, and Robert Lai, the leader of the German Workers' Front, all had claims on the lives of the children. They tend to partner up against Bormann and Hess. Many regulations, particularly reforming primary education, were delayed. Now, that infighting by Nazis, all of whom saw themselves as having a claim over children, had three side effects. The content of the curriculum was diluted by more traditional influences than was originally intended. Okay, so what, for example, took until the late 1930s for many of the new textbooks to come into the school system. It wasn't introduced efficiently. Lots of conflict between authors, publishers, Bernhard Rust's ministry, a separate department, the censorship office controlled by a Nazi called Philipp Bühler. So huge delays. So that therefore meant that the old textbooks of the Weimar era did hang on for many years in many subject areas. So that's a good example of inefficiency. The persistence of confusion within the schools as to how to deliver the curriculum. It wasn't so much as bad teaching, it was more confused teachers. It wasn't so much uncooperative teachers. Many teachers were right-wing in their inclinations, had been disillusioned with the Weimar Republic. In the early years were voters of the Nazis. They were middle class. Many of the middle classes, of course, supported the Nazis into power. But the confusion and the administrative inefficiency meant that many of them were not teaching in a satisfactory way, according to the Nazis. And that just led to general unhappiness amongst the teachers. So at first the Nazis received widespread support from teachers, but eventually teachers became one of the most disillusioned groups. The other key feature in terms of failings is the decline in standards. When you've got constant intrusion of ideology, especially racism, then you're going to have a decline in standards. Children are not being taught to think for themselves. And that had a knock-on effect on universities. And we do know that universities frequently complained about the poor quality of their students. And even those elite schools, the Napolers, the Adolf Hitler schools, the Order Castles, were affected and delivered nothing like the quantities of leadership originally anticipated. Lee then moves on to universities, indoctrination in universities. The Nazis abolished the aim of pursuing academic excellence through academic freedom, which of course is the whole purpose of universities. Universities therefore had a new role, and that was effectively to indoctrinate young people in the spirit of the Volksgemeinschaft. The vehicle for doing that was the National Socialist, there should be a capital S there, German Students' Association, founded in 1926, very radicalised. Students were empowered to put pressure on professors and lecturers. They were part of that sort of coordination from below. Best example, of course, is May 1933, the book burning outbreak throughout German universities, where banned authors, a list was produced by Philipp Bühler's censorship office. Their books were publicly burned in university, in front of universities. Okay, so an analysis of that, there was an alarming decline in enrolment at universities, and those figures are quite stark. See the downward decline there. They effectively more than halved in 5 years. What kept higher education going was the rapid increase in numbers of women students. As male students were conscripted, more and more women went to universities. In this way, higher education survived despite Nazi policy, not because of it. So universities did continue. If it wasn't for that, then effectively universities could just have collapsed. But again, the impact on, in particular, the sciences, especially physics, huge damage to Germany's capacity to produce advanced weapons technology during the war years. No coincidence that America produced the atomic bomb in 1945 and not Nazi Germany, largely because many of the academics, the physics lecturers and professors from German universities left Germany after Hitler took power in 1933, and many of them took their skills and experiences to the USA. Okay, just to sort of finish off then, Lee then moves into the mobilisation of youth movements. Initially, there were 120,000 members of the Hitler Youth, which was relatively small compared to the large number of children who were attended other youth organisations. But the Hitler Youth, of course, expanded rapidly after 1933, partly the result of the banning of all other youth groups in 1933, partly as a result of the Hitler Youth Law of the 1st of December 1936, which effectively made it illegal for children to attend any youth organisation other than the Nazis, although it didn't become law until 1939, the second Hitler Youth Law, where children had to join the Hitler Youth. But 2.3 million members, 30%, increased to 77% by 1938. And finally, a section on historians' interpretations. Most of the post-war interpretations, e.g. Jarman writing in the 1950s, fully made that assumption that the state controlled the minds of the German children, made that sort of built-in assumption. Those old interpretations have not been completely rejected. It was certainly true that the Hitler Youth was very, very popular, especially in the early years, many young people that collective sense of collective power that Hitler gave them to challenge the traditional forms of authority. Children found that very, very appealing in the early years, 1933 to sort of 36, 37. But then the pendulum swung against that argument. Those are the names of key historians who placed more emphasis on the partial loss of the appeal, particularly during the war years. Undoubtedly, many young people continued to be enthusiastic supporters to the end, but many became increasingly disillusioned, particularly with the sort of onerous obligations, the way in which the Hitler Youth, for example, became a military boot camp, etc. So working class children in particular, many of them became Edelweiss pirates. They would simply not attend Hitler Youth, they would pick fights with them. Middle class children tend to rebel in different ways. They would often just listen to jazz music from the USA and just refuse to conform. But more recent historians have partly swung back to the 1950s, people like Jarman, the views that actually the Hitler Youth was very, very effective. And in particular, there's a historian called Rempel who has argued the key thing about the Hitler Youth is the way it kind of coupled up with the SS. What it did is it supplied the SS with fresh young fighters. Nice little quote there. After 1933, when many old fighters were slowly growing weary and fat, eager to enjoy the comforts and pleasures of power, the SS and Hitler Youth provided a wellspring of youthful elan. It's kind of like energy. Without them, Hitler could not have withstood the sceptical old officers of the army. Thus, that tactical alliance between the Hitler Youth and the SS, the Hitler Youth were a recruiting ground for the SS, was a key factor in the SS becoming a state within a state. Got to stop there, I've gone over the time. Hopefully this will upload to YouTube. Hopefully that was useful to you. Thank you.